Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Boyum. I am the president and founder of the Defeating Epilepsy Foundation. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit in Southern California, and our mission is to provide the advocacy and educational resources needed to the epilepsy community and our society. Today, our guest is Ian Bone. Ian is the author of the book Sacred Lives, an account of the history, cultural associations, and social impact of epilepsy. Ian has been a consulting neurologist for over 30 years now and has a son who is battling epilepsy. Thank you, Ian, for joining me today.
Thank you, Natalie.
In today's discussion, we will be discussing Dr. Bone's recent article, Religion, Spirituality, and Epilepsy, which was published recently in the peer-reviewed journal Epilepsy and Behavior. Throughout history, different faiths have had different views when it comes to epilepsy. Many stigmatize people with epilepsy, preventing them from becoming priests, preventing marriage, and accusing them of being possessed are just a few examples. Thank you, Dr. Bone, for joining me today. First off, in reading your article, I thought it was excellent. I really liked the very detailed layout you and Dr. Dine gave about the history of religion and how people with epilepsy were treated. Do you find that even today, certain faiths still stigmatize epilepsy?
I think that's true. And I think the whole history of stigmatization of epilepsy is very deeply embedded in religion and the developments of religion over the years. If you go way, way back in history, way back to the Greeks and their gods, the Greek gods for epilepsy were not necessarily the good gods. They were the gods of the moon or the gods of darkness. And so right at the very, very beginning of these sort of ancient religions, you see this stigmatization appear. You see it in early Babylonian scrolls, for instance, where if you purchased a slave at the market and the slave developed epilepsy within 30 days of you purchasing the slave, then you could return the slave and get your money back.
Oh my goodness.
So, even going back there 2000 years BC, you've got in Babylonian scripts sort of evidence of epilepsy being something that people would not tolerate in the slave that they've purchased. You mentioned the word stigma, and that goes back to that time too, because stigma is a cut. And what you did when you purchased a slave was you made a cut in their skin to show that they belonged to you. You did the same thing to people who were criminals. They also had a mark, a tattoo, or a stigma placed on them. And finally, you did it to people with medical conditions, of which epilepsy was one of the commonest, to have a mark placed upon the body of someone with the condition to tell the public that this is what they had. So the whole history, if you like, is embedded in the earliest of religions. And we see it going through our religions right up almost until the present day in some religions. There's a survey in Saudi Arabia, for instance, looking at people who I think were school teachers, and they were asked questions about epilepsy, and a significant number of them, and this is a study, a fairly recent study, a significant number still thought that demonic possession was one of the causes.
Oh, wow.
Or contagion was another cause. So it's still out there, if you like. People still believe that.
I'm really shocked because knowing how much Saudi Arabia focuses on education, particularly in health. I mean, when my husband was at UB, a number of the graduate students in the perio department and other fields came over from Saudi Arabia because the government paid for their education. And in return, when they went home, they worked in the poor communities in the community clinics. So knowing how much they value education, I'm shocked to hear that in Saudi Arabia, of all places, that you would still hear something like that.
I think even closer to home in the United Kingdom, there was a study of various religions looking at their perception of what caused epilepsy. And there was still a significant number of people who felt that evil spirits or jinn spirits were the explanation for somebody having seizures. Wow. Other people also believed that epilepsy was a a consequence, if you like, a punishment for something you've done wrong in a previous life. So, you know, the stigma that we live with today, as I say, has this basis that has run through our religions and run through our cultures for thousands of years.
I can relate to the second one because when I was in a very deep level of depression previous years, there was one thing I actually brought up to a friend. I said, I must have been a real horrible person in a former life for God to put me down this path. I said, I feel God's teaching me to start having some empathy and do the right thing in this life. So, I mean, I think even people with epilepsy can tie themselves to those things at times when they're dealing with the frustrations of how did I end up with this? I mean, even if you're
Yes,
born with it or injury, when you hit a low path, a lot of times you feel like you're trying to figure out why did I end up on this journey?
yes, 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 absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. Well, I found it very interesting in a part of the article where in the New Testament,
Yes.
epilepsy appears to be a recognized disorder, yet there was no evidence that people understood that it was a neurological disorder. They talk about Jesus casting the demons, causing epilepsy, casting epilepsy out of the sick, healing them and showing empathy for them. Yet by the Middle Ages, Christianity considered people with epilepsy as possessed by Satan, putting them through painful exorcisms, many times causing fatal injuries. What led to such a dark change?
I don't know why it happened. I mean, first of all, in the Bible, and I've got a few little quotes that I just will run through from the St. James version of the Bible, Matthew 4, verse 24, talking about Jesus. It says, so his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them all. And when we go into 3 of the Gospels, actually refer to the boy with epilepsy. They refer, and again, I'll read this is from, where are we? Mark 9, verse 20. It says, the boy convulses and falls to the ground and foams at the mouth before Jesus cast the demon out. So here in the Bible, we've got the demon as the
Yeah.
cause for the epilepsy. There's an understanding of what epilepsy is. There are very good descriptions in the Gospels of seizures, particularly in relation to this one boy who appears in 3 of the Gospels. And yet in each of the 3 Gospels, there is the casting out of demons. And on one occasion, the disciples see the boy and try and cleanse him of his epilepsy. It doesn't work. And so they call Jesus along. And Jesus blames the parents for having so little faith. That's why the demon is still there. If your parents had more faith, you would be cured of the condition. And Jesus does get rid of the demon from the boy with epilepsy. So in 3 of the Gospels, and the word epileptic is used in the Gospels as well, the St. James version of the Gospels. So I agree with what you're saying. There is an understanding of what it is. There's a sympathy for seeing what's happened. There is an attempt to cure it, but there is a misunderstanding as to what the cause of it is. So yes, I agree. It's a sympathetic approach in the Bible. It's when you get to the Renaissance, when you get to the Middle Ages, that people start talking about witchcraft, warlocks, and the fact that epilepsy is a manifestation of something that has to be exorcised, to be got rid of. You mentioned exorcism. There's a film called The Exorcism of Emily Rose. And there's a German version called Requiem. And this is about actually a girl who died at the age of 23 in 1976, Angelise Michael, a real life person. And she had suffered 67 attempts at exorcism and subsequently died as a result of the treatment that she received.
Oh, wow.
That is 1976 in Germany.
That would be the last place I'd be thinking.
Exactly. Absolutely. The last place. Absolutely. Yeah. But it's a film, the German version, Requiem, is more true to the story. But the Exorcism of Emily Rose, or Requiem, are 2 accounts of the same story that tells you basically how people, as recently as then, approached epilepsy. The parents involved the local priest, and the local priest then embarked upon these recurring episodes of attempted exorcism until the poor girl eventually died.
Oh, wow. Now, just out of curiosity, I don't know if I know when I read through your article, I didn't see it, but I'm very I have a very high passion for history, so I love learning about different cultures and different times. In the time of the Dark Ages, when people who were accused of witchcraft were executed by being burnt at the stake, have you seen any information on that where people burnt at the stake for seizures?
Yes, and in fact, the document that I've referred to, the medieval document, I can never say the word correctly, but it's Malleus Maleficarum. It's a Dominican treatise written in 1487, and it viewed seizures as being the hallmark of witchcraft.
Oh, wow.
And recommended, as you say, the stake or punishment for this. So people who had seizures were sought out, and they were persecuted.
Because I know you mentioned in your article about Joan of Arc possibly having epilepsy, and I always wondered, I know she had some conflicts with leading in the army and her very high devoutness to God and everything, but I always wondered if it was something tied to epilepsy that led to her execution.
There's a kind of division of opinion on this, and there are some people who feel fairly strongly she was having a combination of auditory hallucinations and visual hallucinations. And those who argue that it wasn't epilepsy say, well, the theme was always the same. The theme was to go out and to get involved in fighting the war that she was fighting. There was a purpose behind her hallucinations and her visions. Other people comment how frequently the auditory hallucinations were, and they wonder if she may not have had some very rare form of hereditary epilepsy that gave rise to auditory attacks. And this is a type of epilepsy now where the genetics have been worked out. And if you have DNA, you can make a diagnosis. Joan of Arc was burnt at the stake, and her body, her ashes were thrown into the Seine. So there is no DNA of Joan of Arc around anymore to see whether, in fact, she might have had this very recently described form of hereditary epilepsy that causes auditory hallucinations. I think, like so many things in history, you can read so much into it all, and there's always uncertainty. And if you go to websites that talk about famous people with epilepsy, there are so many people from that era. But the truth is, we'll never know. We'll never know at all.
No, but it's really interesting as people are digging through history, how much more common we're finding it is compared to what we may have thought 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. And of course, in those days, it would have been concealed or not understood, and there would be many reasons for concealing it. Again, if there was so much stigma associated with it, people would not step forward and say, well, I have epilepsy. I mean, one of the most compelling examples of somebody who probably did have epilepsy is Peter the Great. And there's quite a lot of literature that supports that, and quite a lot of actually witnessed accounts that have been written down of his seizures. But obviously, someone in that position would see epilepsy as a vulnerability. And they wouldn't be saying to other people, I have epilepsy, because it would have been seen as a weakness.
Yes, no, and I think it still is. I mean, even myself being outspoken about having it, I don't regret it because I realized at a point I had to, but I admit every once in a while, it's still almost like I still in a way still want to hide it, especially not so much when it comes to family or my advocacy, but when it comes to my career, when I'm being, if I have to go and I've gone into interviews in the past, scared, not wanting people to know about it, or even when I finished my master's and I had people looking at my LinkedIn page, I thought how many companies probably saw my work, thought this is great. And then when they saw the reason why I was so passionate, went liability.
Mm.
and
I
moved
know, I
on
know,
and
I
moved
know,
on
I
from
know,
my page.
I know.
But I think that's the biggest challenge people are finding now in the 21st century, not so much worrying about execution, but just basic survival in society.
Survival, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
So today, Christianity continues to look down upon those battling epilepsy. Tony Calejo, who is the politician responsible for creating the Americans with Disabilities Act, was not allowed to become a Catholic priest after being diagnosed with epilepsy. Even though we are not seeing the level of abuse we once did, I have had people with epilepsy tell me that they were banned from attending some churches, being told that they were going to bring demons in. What can people do to educate religious leaders to end the stigma?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, you're absolutely correct in terms of the fact that to go to church and to take communion was something that was not possible, but has gradually become possible. The Roman Catholic, I'm just sort of looking it up to get it absolutely right, but it's the Code of Canon Law of the Roman Catholic Church. And by 1983, it wasn't possible for somebody to become a priest who had epilepsy. I'm not sure that that regulation has ever been taken out of law. I'm not sure if it still applies or doesn't apply. I really don't know. And maybe there might be somebody out there who's more of an expert in me in Catholic canon law who might be able to reassure us and say, yes, a priest can now, with a person with epilepsy now can become a priest. I suspect they can, but I'm not sure if it's ever been actually changed in the law itself. I don't know. I don't know. In terms of what the church can do, well, the church does a lot. And obviously the attitudes of the past, I mean, the church does an enormous amount in terms of supporting people with all sorts of health conditions. And things have changed very much for the better. When they started changing was really towards the end of the 19th century. And there was a movement of basically well-educated, wealthy philanthropists who would start off establishing hospices and respite homes for people with epilepsy. And one of the most outstanding was an American, William Letchworth, and Letchworth. And William Letchworth toured Europe, seeing how epilepsy was looked after there, and came back to America and established in New York, Craig Colony, which was one of the very first colonies to look after people with epilepsy who could not manage in the community, and to give them a kind of pastoral care. I mean, there were no drugs for them at that stage.
Yeah.
It was basically to give a life that was quiet, a life that was non-threatening, and a life that was safe. And he did an enormous amount, but part of what he brought into his Craig Colony and places like that was the need for religious instruction. So if you were taken in as somebody they would care for, the other side of the coin was that religious instruction would be available for you. So people at the end of the 19th century, a lot of religious people did establish pastoral care and support for people with epilepsy.
Yeah, because I mean, myself growing up with epilepsy and my family being Catholic, my mother's family, that it really wasn't anything talked down upon, at least not that I remember. And the church never stopped me from doing my confession or communion or anything. I was never told that I was not welcome to. In fact, for a number of years, I took part in service and helped with the readings and everything during mass when I went to private school. But it's the one thing I did hear about the experience. My grandmother's youngest brother, his daughter was a nun for a number of years, and sadly, both her parents, my grandmother's brother and his wife, had drinking problems, and it really caused a toxic effect in all their relationships. And when her mother died, she had a nervous breakdown. She went into a very severe depression, and the priest made her resolve her vows, and she had to leave the convent. And I always thought that was incredibly sad after years of dedicating her life to
Yes,
the
yes.
church and God when she needed them the most. And my grandmother was explaining that mental illness or depression was very looked down upon, and that they could not separate, the thought of it. It wasn't demonic, but it was something they very much shifted away from at the time. I don't know if it still is that way, but my grandmother, that was one thing that really upset my grandmother, was she felt that those who served at the time when they were at their weakness and really needed spiritual support really did not get it.
Yes. I think one other thing and that is the support that the church gives. And there are saints for people with epilepsy.
Mhm.
And I suppose the most famous saint for people with epilepsy is St. Valentine. We think of Valentine's Day as being exchanging cards, but St. Valentine was or is a patron saint for epilepsy. It's a little confusing because there's more than one St. Valentine. There are several of them. And there was a German, well, the word Valentine actually sounds very like the old German for falling down.
Oh.
So no one's quite sure whether it's just by chance that because the name sounds like falling down, that St. Valentine became the saint for epilepsy. But there are various prayers for people with epilepsy that can be given up. There's St. Ginnis's prayer for people with epilepsy. There was a hostel for people with epilepsy in Germany a long, long time ago in the 18th century that was named after St. Valentine. So the saints, if you like, did offer some sort of support in that they were there for people with various conditions to pray to in the hope of a cure. So, there was support there. There were also religious artifacts that people with epilepsy might carry around with them in the hope that that would prevent them from having seizures in the days before any drugs were available. So the church did offer, through its saints, it did offer some support for people, not just with epilepsy, but for a host of medical conditions. There were also, if you in Mexico and in France, there are what are called I think it's votive tablets. If you have a child, say, with epilepsy, and you go to church and pray for the child to get better, and the child does get better, then you have to make a presentation or a gift to the church in which you prayed. And these were often paintings of the child with the devil coming out of the mouth, if you like, the demon coming out of the mouth because the demon had been got rid of. And these were given to the church as a mark of thanks for curing a condition.
Oh, wow. Well, it's interesting.
The church did offer more than just stigmatization. It did offer people with a host of medical conditions a sanctuary and a place to go and pray, and a place where they might hope that through their particular saint, they might get a cure.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's really, I find it interesting. There's pros and cons to both of it. You have the stigmatization, but then also resources along the way to help with healing, almost trying to find balance.
Yes.
In the article, you talk about the Prophet Muhammad and the founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, of possibly having temporal lobe epilepsy. Joseph Smith was quoted from a solitary source saying, quote, "I saw a pillar of light exactly over my head above the brightness of the sun, which descended gradually until it fell on me. When I came to myself again, I found myself lying on my back, looking up at heaven," end quote. Could an experience like this possibly be a seizure?
It could be. And again, it's very difficult to know what to read into these sort of things. There's a term that's used, and that is where a seizure may have a profound, possibly religious connotation. And these are termed ecstatic seizures. And these are seizures where it is claimed or felt by some that maybe people will have a sudden moment of revelation, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, a sudden moment where something physically happens to them that makes them see a new light or a new direction in their life. The person we think of the most with ecstatic seizures is Dostoevsky, the Russian writer. And there's something that Dostoevsky wrote that I'd just like to read if I can find it, because it says so much about the so-called ecstatic seizures. This is Dostoevsky writing about a seizure. And he says, This is him experiencing the seizure. He says, the air was filled with a big noise, and I thought that it had engulfed me. I have really touched God. He came to me myself. Yes, God exists, I cried, and I don't remember anything after that.
Oh, wow.
So there is Dostoevsky implying a religious experience through having a seizure. And people have looked into this. They thought, well, have people suddenly seen a light, change their direction in light as a consequence of a seizure? There are plenty of anecdotes, but when you actually start to study it by asking large numbers of people with epilepsy if they've experienced events that have made them change their religious direction, you really don't get any hard evidence at all. There are people like Dostoevsky. There's a question of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. Many people see his event on that road as a moment where he saw God and changed the way that he lived his life. But it's all very uncertain, I'm afraid. It's all very speculative.
Yeah. Well, what was really interesting, one of my interns did a paper on ecstatic seizures. We have on our YouTube channel a video of it. And when she was researching the one writer you just talked about, she also researched some case studies on it. And there were some people who were part of the studies who admitted to the doctors they didn't want to take their medicine because when they did have these seizures, it was a very uplifting, very pleasurable experience, and they didn't want the medication to stop that. And I thought that was so ironic because I have the total opposite. I go into a full panic before having one. I thought I would love to have a happy one for once.
I can quote Dostoevsky again here, and he's again talking to people generally. He says, you all healthy people can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our attack.
Wow.
Now, that's Dostoevsky, and that's what he experienced. Ecstatic seizures is very much a minority feeling. But what he was saying was the feeling that he got, the feeling of elation that he got, was something that was not comparable. And I suppose in some people they do get this, but in the vast, vast majority of people, we do not.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people would not wish to have their epilepsy because of what they experienced during the attack. They would wish quite the reverse.
Oh, absolutely. But I thought it was interesting because it was the first time in all the research I've done to actually hear cases where people would say, I really don't want to take my medicine for this. It really is a joyful event when I have it. So it was so interesting where so many people either feel sick or scared or so many other symptoms that would traumatize somebody who may never had a seizure before, to hear cases of people feeling uplifted by it. It was interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Does that happen primarily in the temporal lobe when they have ecstatic seizures?
I think it is. I don't know for certain, and I don't know of any detailed study, because I think ecstatic seizures are probably quite rare. But yes, I think they're usually associated with temporal lobe. Yes, yes.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, just to get back to Dostoevsky, because maybe because of what he felt about his epilepsy, he championed epilepsy. And in most of his novels, the main characters have epilepsy. The best example is Prince Miskin in The Idiot, who has epilepsy. And he is, if you like, almost an epilepsy superhero. He is somebody who is well loved and well respected and well balanced and lives his life with his epilepsy. So Dostoevsky championed epilepsy. Yes, he did.
And in a way, I think that's wonderful. I mean, a lot of people would wonder why someone would take an approach like that, but I think at least my guess is in his own way, trying to take the stigma off of it and trying to let people know what you think I'm going through is not as bad as you're thinking, trying to find a more accepting approach.
Yes, absolutely.
But so for people who are battling epilepsy, has religion played a part in helping to deal with anxiety and depression?
I think the answer is yes. And I think, and there have been lots of studies looking at many conditions and how people coping with illness. And I think coping with illness is something that if you have a belief, if you're part of a community, then I believe coping with illness, positive coping, is more likely to happen. And there are studies that have looked at positive coping strategies in church attenders, non-church attenders. So I think across the board, whatever you're dealing with, whatever physical problem you're dealing with, if you are part of a community, if you have a belief, then I think these help. What I don't believe in, what me personally I don't believe in, I don't believe that there is somebody up there, if you like, who, because you're a good person and go to church every day, is going to make your seizures better controlled than the person who doesn't.
Yes, I agree.
I don't believe there's a divinity that would function like that. So I believe what religion offers is companionship and positive thinking and coping strategies.
Yes. Well, coping strategies for sure. I mean, a couple of times I was in the hospital younger and not doing well. They would always send the priest to come by to check on me.
Yes,
and we would pray, just because
yes.
at that time I was in my teenage years and my sister and brother were still babies. So my mother couldn't come up to the hospital. So it was, at times it was very stressful to be alone. So thankfully, because of it being a Catholic hospital, they did what they could to offer some comfort with my mother not being able to be there.
Yes.
So no, I think that's very important that they're working towards those that kind of support to help people with coping skills.
Mm-hmm. There's one other aspect to that too, and that is there's always been this question with epilepsy about what people have unfortunately called the epileptic personality.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something that's crept into the literature through anecdote and has been basically dismissed. It doesn't exist. But part of that personality was meant to be I can't say it, religiosity. That people with epilepsy were more likely to be parts of cults or parts of religions or what have you. I think the bottom line is that has been dismissed completely. It's something that actually appears in our paper. We look at the evidence for it and we say, well, the evidence is all anecdotal. It's there's no hard evidence. And basically, if you look at people with any long-term condition, whatever it is, some people will cling on to some things, some people will cling on to other things, but there's nothing to suggest that people with epilepsy are more prone to be over-religious than those with rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes or what have you. But this concept of the epileptic personality has been stigmatizing. It's been, it's unfortunate. And I think the good thing is that it's no longer part of our vocabulary.
Oh, that's good. No, I never knew that. I mean, I've known plenty of people when they've gone through, let's say something really bad like cancer, being diagnosed with cancer or a sudden death of a loved one, may turn to religion suddenly, trying to find comfort. But I mean, I really haven't known anybody, at least here in the epilepsy community, who I can say is hyper religious due to epilepsy.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, there were other parts of that personality that, again, thankfully, we can dismiss. That weren't very, very complimentary.
Yeah.
And thankfully, that is all part of history now. But it served for a long time to stigmatize people with epilepsy.
Yeah. I mean, I think the only thing I ever worried about in my life being stigmatized about when it came to my epilepsy, and it wasn't so much because of my head trauma, it was the medication I was on at the time. I was very hypersensitive as a child and became emotional quite easily. And I felt a lot of times my tendency to cry very easily was held against me, and I became very embarrassed if I became emotional.
Yes.
So I think it's little things like that that people with epilepsy, it's hard to say, you can't get over it, but you have to learn to adapt to it. That's why
Mm.
when I talk to doctors and I tell them it's so important to, when it comes to having a doctor-patient relationship, yes, taking your medicine is essential, but that's
Mhm.
just one piece of the puzzle. I've been really blessed lately to talk to some doctors and talk to some researchers, and they've asked me, well, how could our product better serve the community, or what should we do to help patients more? And I said, you have to look at all the possible things. How are they mentally? How are they nutrition
Absolutely.
wise? How is their stress? How is their sleep? There's so many things. I said, in the 80s as a kid here, it was don't question the doctor and take your medicine. And it
Mhm.
failed so many of us over here in the
Mhm.
States. It really
Mhm.
caused a lot of tension and unnecessary trauma for so many patients,
Mhm.
where I'm very grateful. I'm working with my new neurologist and seeing the reviews, especially of the bigger universities. They're realizing now that they have to transition towards something new. The what was it, in 2019 I got invited to an epilepsy synopsis, and it was kind of ironic. I think somebody thought that I was a doctor with the work I was doing, because it was for
Mhm.
like the MDs, DOs, PhDs. So my husband having a PhD, I decided to take advantage of it, and I said,
Right.
you know what,
Right.
you're going to sneak in on me. I want I want notes. And so he went, and he said what was really refreshing to hear was one of the neurologists who presented said, the goal had always been, we're just going to get the seizures under control. He goes, we're now realizing that's just the first step.
That's absolutely right. And it's funny because that kind of comment goes back a way, way, way back in time when I can't remember the name of the neurologist, but it goes back, I think, to the 1940s, somebody who said it's not just controlling the seizures, it's restoring people to the life that they would have lived if they hadn't had the seizures. It's
Exactly.
restoring the other things. And I mean, when I started off as a neurologist in 1978, an awful long time ago. And in those days, the approach to people at the clinic was counting seizures. People would have a seizure diary, and they bring their diary in, and the doctor would look through the diary and count the number of seizures and adjust the dose of the drug, and away you'd go. And there was no question of addressing social issues, absolutely none at all. And
Mhm.
there was one neurologist in the United Kingdom at that time, a very clever man, Anthony Hopkins, who a very well-respected British neurologist. And he was virtually the first neurologist to say, hey, what about the social consequences of illness? And he employed a young researcher, a young sociologist, and they did a study looking at about 80 or 90 people who had epilepsy in the community around the local hospital they served. And they started asking them the questions that up until then no one had ever asked. Do you have a boyfriend, a girlfriend? Do you have a job? Um, what did you feel like when you were told you had epilepsy? All of these things had never really been asked before. And Anthony Hopkins was the first British neurologist with this young sociologist, Graham Scrambler. They were the very first people to actually ask people with epilepsy about their lives, not about the number of seizures they were having.
Oh wow. And it's so necessary. One, it's amazing to see that far back he saw things needed to change, and that
Mm.
to see more and more doctors pushing for it is good, because I think what really contributes to the complexity of epilepsy is, you know, like I said, I wouldn't be alive without my medicine. It is
Yes,
essential
yes.
for so many of us. But I remember, because of the lack of education, particularly my parents received about epilepsy, it was very easy for them to be overprotective, and it caused a very isolating childhood.
Yes,
and
yes,
and not
yes.
because of cruelty or anything. It's just the constant what if was in my mother's mind. Well, if I let her ride her bike over to her friends, what if she has a seizure and falls off her
I
bike?
know, I
What
know,
if
I
we
know,
go this in, I mean, I could write a book on all the what ifs my mother
I know,
my
I
mother
know,
dealt with.
I know. Absolutely, absolutely. And I
Mhm.
think those, I mean, that again is something that, I wrote about in Sacred Lives, and that is how difficult it is with a young child diagnosed with epilepsy, how you try and adjust to all of those sort of things, like riding a bike, like going on a trampoline, like going swimming, all of these issues that other people just take for granted and don't think twice about. But if you're the parent of someone with epilepsy, it's soul searching. What is safe, what is not safe? What could go wrong? Yeah.
No, absolutely. Is there anything else you would like to share with us today?
I hope, again, to get back to religion and epilepsy. And I think you've put your finger on it. There are positives and there are negatives. And whereas we may blame religion as being part of the stigmatization process, we also have to accept that it does offer a place, a refuge, companionship, and support. And there's no doubt that the beginning of changing attitudes to people with epilepsy in society, in terms of trying to integrate people who with poorly controlled epilepsy before drug treatment, we have to hand the credit to that to people from religious backgrounds who founded the very first colonies, respites, founded farms out in the country, all of these things that were then set up that took people with epilepsy away, to be honest, in those days from the poorhouses, from the jails, from the asylums, took them away from that and recognized that this was a condition that really required a lot of care and support. So I think religion, positives and negatives. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Again, I want to thank Ian for coming and taking part. To see the great work we are doing, please like our social media pages and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We invite you to visit our website at www.defeatingepilepsy.org to see how we are making a difference in the epilepsy community. Thank you for your support, and together we will defeat epilepsy. Take care.